Hello and welcome to another episode of The Improvement Man. Today we're going to be looking at what is value, and we'll be looking at value stream mapping in a non-manufacturing case study. Today's discussion point is what is value and why is it so confusing. I'll be covering tools and techniques I use to try and find value in a process. And finally, I'll be covering a case study in a licensing department where I'll be going into a bit more detail on the value stream map that I used. This upskill is aimed at people who would like pointers on what is value from a change context. And if you wish to use this video and reuse it to help the community grow, please go right ahead. For those that want to reach out and contact me for a good old virtual chinwag, you can contact me on helpmeimprovementman@gmail.com. I do try and get down to any comments or any instant messages in LinkedIn. So what is value? In short, it's really what the name suggests. And why is it confusing? Because sometimes it's difficult to find out who the customer is. Sometimes you have internals and external customers. And sometimes you wonder if what you do in where you work adds any value to the final product that your company delivers. And from a pure lean context, in essence, it's what customers are willing to pay for, because you always start with the customer and work backwards. Taking that concept a little further, whenever I've taught anyone about what value is within their business, especially if we've mapped out processes and tried to find out what's non-value added or business value added, we come across internal and external customers. And I thought it's probably a good idea just to try and define that a little more. So when we talk about external customers, we're talking about the end customer, the people who are actually paying for the goods. And the questions we ask that what defines that customer is, what are they willing to pay for? What are they actually buying from the company? Why would they choose your product or service over others? And what will they want in the future? And that all sort of defines the value. So in the sense of what will they want in the future, an example is if I buy an item from, let's say, Sony, a well-known brand, the reason I'm buying it is because I want the interconnectivity of Sony products with other Sony products in the future if I ever tend to upgrade. That's the value I find in there. Now, internal customers is slightly different, and you come across some quite interesting conversations where people say, well, I've got nothing to do with the end customer. What value do I add to the company? And so good questions to ask are, what would happen if your activity stopped in your department? And a classic one is payroll. Does the end customer pay for your company to have a payroll function? And usually the answer is no. But internally, if payroll had to stop, more than likely there'll be a lot of angry employees because they're not getting paid. The next question is, does the business see importance in what our department deliver? And you could also question that like marketing. Why would an external company pay for marketing? An external customer pay for any marketing? And the answer is they wouldn't. They really don't care if you have a marketing department or not. They want the product that you are marketing, not necessarily the glossy brochure. There's very little value in that. And so therefore, do the business see, well, actually we need a marketing department because otherwise how are we going to get our products out to market? We've got a push system going here, and we'll cover push and pull in another video. And finally, is whatever we do an enabler or a catalyst that brings value to other parts of the business that will enable them to deliver value to the customer? And I suppose if you can answer those sort of three questions, you can sort of define what's an internal customer and an external customer and find what the value is. And values are very individual to each business. For example, if we take Amazon, they value customer experience far more than they value profitability. And this is demonstrated where you hear about stories of Amazon putting parcels in the back of taxis to meet customer delivery dates. In order to map the value a little easier and to see where the value is occurring, I use the following tools. I use process mapping to map the activity. And then once the activity is mapped, I do a value-added, non-value added business analysis. You can sometimes use value-added, non-value-added, and another term which I class as business value-added. As I described before, there are certain activities that the business find really helpful and they're willing to pay for. I also use SciPox, which is a really useful tool to try and identify the customer. Note, in some instances, some companies call it COPIS, which is just SciPoc backwards, which is customer, outputs, processes, inputs, and supplier. So starting at the customer and working backwards, which I think is a pretty good way of using it. Then we've got the classic VSMs, which are value stream maps, and I use this to map resource and information. And finally, I use a lot of workshops and interviews, and this is usually to get buy-in and to gain more knowledge of the system's tools, which I might not necessarily know when I first land on site. So as promised, from instant messages to some of the feedback that I've gotten, people would like to hear a little bit more about how I've used a value stream map in a non-manufacturing environment. Before we get to the value stream map, a little context on the case study. As always, all names, facts and figures have been changed in order to protect the anonymity of people and companies. So, the client request. Improvement man, can you find out where the waste is for this licensing department? In order to find the waste, you first have to know what is valuable and what you wish to keep. The background of this was that the company had the licensing agreement for the last 15 years and had never gone to tender before that. The contract is with the government, and this is the first time ever that they'll be asked to go to tender. The contract has always made a loss, and it has been seen as part of the institution. The contract was treated a bit like an unwanted guest because of the image issues of being almost a tax collector and asking the public for money for a very, shall we say, it was quite a controversial, and the value of having a license was not fully seen by the public. So therefore the end customers, who are the public, sees the license as almost a grudge tax which they'd rather not pay. And therefore figuring out who the customer is and then what is the value becomes kind of tricky, because you've got multiple customers but they are in direct conflict with each other. The government wants the taxpayers' money, the taxpayers don't really want to pay, and the service that's provided and where the funding of all that money goes to is from for the services they consume is from the licenses. So the activities we performed, we first created the vision for the project, and that was to get in the best possible shape for tender. So whenever we went to any workshops or anyone asked a question on why were we in their department or why were we looking at what they were doing, the answer would always be to get into the best possible shape for the tender because we really don't want to lose this. And that sort of rallied everyone behind a common goal onto why we were doing the process improvement in their area. We then used the basic tools, which are SciPox, to find out who were the internal and external stakeholders we needed to be concerned about and which processes mapped to them. We then mapped the processes to a level 3, and we'll cover the levels and how to process map in another video. But we wanted to understand the activities that could be optimized. We carried out workshops and interviews to replay the findings back to the business, holding up a mirror to them to see where they were potentially doing activities which added no value. Some of our team went out on a Gemba, which meant they were literally walking 20 miles a day from house to house doing inspections. So this gave a real sort of camaraderie, and when we started playing back the information that was gathered from from the Gemba, it added a real credibility to what we were doing and how we were doing it, because we literally walked the miles in their shoes and saw the issues firsthand. And finally, to play this back to the senior team, we decided to use a value stream map. So on to VSMs. VSMs are tried and tested in the manufacturing world, and they work very well. The issue that happens when it gets translated over into the service sector is that a lot of the terminology that is used does not translate over as easily. What I like about VSMs are that you're able to see information flows and material flows, or resources, how they're being used. So if we take the core of what a VSM is trying to show, information and resources, we can convert it into something that will be able to be shown to anyone in the service sector without them thinking, this is a manufacturing tool, why are you showing it to us? So when we look at it from first principles of Lean, what does the customer look for? We start to need to use language that is readily available and what the C-suite and below are used to. So when we start looking at things like lag times, we had to remove them in this scenario because of legal considerations, i.e. we couldn't give them more reminders in a 2-week period. They have to have them, the customer has to have the reminder at a certain period. Also, who is the customer? This was quite a difficult question for us to originally ask, because who's the boss? Theoretically, the public is the boss of the government. Or is the government the customer because they give the company who does this the commission? So we had to work that out in our head, because we were collecting money from one source, which was the public, but are also given money as well from the government. So hopefully in the next couple of slides you'll see how we broke down this problem and we're able to translate that back to the C-suite. This is the style of the VSM we presented back to the C-suite. On the right hand side we started at the customer, being the government, and they demanded that there was 100% of all licensable population acquired, and that was the information they were sending backwards, and they had quarterly meetings. During that period, they paid the licensing company 7.5 million. The licensing company on the left-hand side then followed a process. They had the first part of the process, which cost them 500k, where they were able to achieve 50% of the licensable population, 1 week before the license was due. Spending another 200k, they acquired a further 20%, 2 weeks afterwards. That process continued to a third, fourth, fifth and sixth reminder, where the laws of diminishing returns came to play. A secondary process was started off at the same time as the third reminder, where legal and enforcement cost the company 6.8 million, which generated another 6% return. The lawbreakers were put into their own little box, and that costs the government around 3.2 million, and that was the population of about 15%. And in all, the total cost of the organisation to run was 8.3 million. So we broke it down a little further for the C-suite by saying this. In the green box, that's your value-added processes. You only spent 700k and it returns you 70% of the 7.5 million you're being paid. So a fantastic return on investment. The blue box is the business value added, where getting the extra 5% only costs another 300k and we're up to 75%. The legal and the enforcement, which is the bulk of the costs for the business, anything in business value added we should be looking to reduce the cost of it and do the whole lean and Kaizen sort of programs to bring down the cost of the business spend to achieve those same results. Highlighted in red are all the what we would class as non-value added activities, where the cost of doing those activities is far greater than the returns they were going to return. And finally, the lawbreakers. That box there was to ask the business to think about how could we work smarter, not harder, to try and decrease the amount of evasion that was happening. Is there any sort of initiatives we could perform to try and make it a little easier to crack down on the people who were evading, or make the punishment so bad that people just didn't want to evade anymore? Was there any technology we could use to highlight evaders a little easier? So we started to bring all these ideas to the table to see what would happen. The results of our 6-month projects were 500k in hard savings through digitization, 900k in savings to the P&L, 60 to 80k in savings for getting the sales channels switched to the more cheaper channels. By that we mean people were more encouraged to buy their licenses from e-licenses and over the internet rather than going into a distributor or vendor. We also further reduced risks to GDPR breaches, as inspectors were carrying around sensitive information in their cars and by hand on pieces of paper. We also increased their capacity by about 30%. And this could either be used by the company to increase sales or to lay off a load of people. And we're happy to report that the company decided to keep the people on and increase the sales. The hardest part of this project, in my opinion, was the stakeholder management, as there were many vested parties and unions involved, and to get everyone's buy-in that this was the right course of action was especially difficult, especially when capacity is mentioned, as unions and other places are very keen not to let workers be exploited, and we shouldn't let workers be exploited, because if they're already walking 20 miles a day, asking them to do another 30% on top of those 20 miles a day is just madness. So we went back to the drawing board and asked them, how could we work smarter rather than harder? So we started to look at ways of contacting unlicensed public without having to do the walking itself, and started to track what potential returns we'd get from there. And with the outbreak of COVID and the lockdown, we found that people, because they were staying at home, they tended to answer their phones a lot more rather than someone knocking on their door. So that proved to be quite successful, and that went down very well with the unions. The strangest thing about this project was that the end customer wasn't very clearly defined. And there's arguments either way to say, actually the government is the customer because they're paying for your service, which is true. But also the public are paying for the service of getting the license. So they're also paying, but the company is handing that money to the government for the government just to pay the company again. So adding value and, what is the voice of the customer? The customer didn't want the product to start with. As we said in the beginning, it's a bit of a grudge tax. So this is one of the strangest cases of where I've had to try and apply voice of the customer too. So, wrapping up, as always, adapt, iterate, and improve. Sometimes we use tools that are trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Change the shape of the tool to fit the requirements of the time, to best help achieve whatever your client is looking for. And that brings us to the end of this upskill. Feedback and comments are most welcome. Please reach out to me on helpmeimprovementman@gmail.com or hit me up on LinkedIn. And if at any time you found that this video was helpful to you, There are more videos on the way, and to get the latest notifications, subscribe below. Thank you very much, and see you next time.